It was early morning when the sun had just begun to rise over the city. The hospital parking lot was already full. Cars lined up one after another and nurses hurried through the automatic glass doors with steaming cups of coffee in hand. Inside, the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with the aroma of fresh brewed coffee from the small cafe near the entrance. It was just another busy day at Westbridge General Hospital. Through those same glass doors walked a woman in her late 40s. She was dressed simply, wearing a long beige coat and a soft blue scarf that looked like it had been knitted by hand. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and though she carried no sign of wealth or power, there was something calm and dignified about her presence. Her name was Dr. Elaine Morris, but to anyone watching she looked like an ordinary visitor, maybe a relative coming to check on a patient, or someone lost looking for directions. No one could have guessed that she was in fact the newly appointed hospital director, the one responsible for running the entire facility. Elaine had decided to come in quietly that morning. She liked to observe before making changes. She believed that if you really wanted to understand a place, you had to see how people behaved when they didn't know you were in charge. So instead of arriving in her car with the hospital's nameplate and parking in the executive space, she had taken the bus, walked the last few blocks, and entered through the public entrance. The lobby was busy. People were waiting for appointments. Nurses were rushing past with clipboards, and a few patients sat in wheelchairs waiting for help. Elaine took a slow look around, smiling softly. She'd spent years working her way up in the medical field, and hospitals always felt like a second home to her, full of life, stories, pain, and hope all mixed together. She walked up to the front desk, where a nurse sat behind the counter, typing rapidly on a computer. The nurse was in her mid-30s with perfectly tied hair and a face that looked constantly impatient. Her name tag read Karen Willis. Elaine waited politely for a few seconds. When Karen didn't look up, she cleared her throat gently and said, "Good morning." Karen barely glanced up, her fingers still moving across the keyboard. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked in a tone that sounded more like annoyance than kindness. Elaine smiled, keeping her voice calm. "I was hoping to get to the administrative wing," she said. "I have an appointment upstairs." Karen frowned, still not fully looking at her. "Administrative wing? That area is restricted to staff only. Are you visiting someone?" "No," Elaine replied softly. "I'm supposed to be in a meeting at 9. Karen finally looked up then, her eyes scanning Elaine from head to toe. Her gaze paused at the scarf, the simple shoes, and the worn handbag. To her, Elaine didn't look like anyone important. She sighed. "Ma'am, you'll need to go through the main clinic. The administrative area isn't open to the public. Take that hallway down to the right and the nurses there will help you." Elaine blinked, a bit surprised but still polite. "Oh, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began. Karen cut her off sharply. "Ma'am, please. We can't have people wandering around. I don't have time for this right now." For a second, Elaine just stood there, her smile fading a little. The nurse had already turned back to her computer screen. Around them, people continued to move. An elderly man coughing into a tissue, a mother trying to calm her crying toddler, an orderly wheeling a stretcher past. Elaine took a small breath. She could have easily revealed who she was, demanded respect, or called for security to report unprofessional behavior, but that wasn't her way. She had seen things like this before, people making quick judgments based on appearances, and she had learned that sometimes silence teaches more than words. Still, the moment stung. She looked at the hallway Karen had pointed toward. The sign above it read Public Outpatient Clinic. That was definitely not where she needed to be. But she also didn't want to cause a scene. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was calm, though her chest felt heavy. She turned a step aside, moving toward one of the benches by the wall. From where she sat, she could still see the front desk. Karen had gone back to typing, looking proud of herself as if she'd handled a disruption efficiently. Elaine clasped her hands in her lap. She had worked her entire life in healthcare, started as a nurse, studied late into the night, earned her degrees, took leadership positions one after another. She had dealt with every kind of person, kind, arrogant, tired, hopeful, rude, desperate, and she'd learned that compassion could change everything. But moments like this reminded her why there was still so much work to be done. The janitor, an older man named Mr. Lewis, came by pushing his mop bucket. He saw Elaine and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Dr. Morris," he said quietly, recognizing her immediately. Elaine smiled back. "Good morning, Mr. Lewis. How's your grandson doing?" "Oh, he's good, ma'am." "Thank you for asking," he replied cheerfully. Then he looked a bit confused. "Are you waiting for someone?" You don't have to sit here." Elaine gave a small nod. "Just observing," she said, and with a light smile added, "Don't tell anyone yet." He chuckled. "My lips are sealed." The exchange was brief, but it warmed her heart. Not everyone judged by what they saw. Some people simply saw others as human beings. She looked back at the nurse's desk again. Karen was now helping a young man who seemed to be filling out paperwork. Her tone had changed completely, polite, even friendly. The difference was clear. He wore a business suit, carried a leather folder, and spoke confidently. Elaine's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. It was a message from Dr. Patel, the chief of surgery. "We're ready whenever you are, Director Morris. Conference room B." She smiled slightly, typing back. "On my way." As she rose from her seat, she noticed an elderly woman struggling with her walker near the reception line. People were stepping around her, rushing to their appointments. Elaine quickly went over and gently took the woman's arm. "Let me help you," she said kindly. "Oh, thank you, dear," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I just need to check in." Elaine helped her up to the counter. Karen looked up, her face tightening again. "Ma'am, I told you," she began, but stopped mid-sentence when she saw the old woman. "Oh, I'm sorry," Karen said quickly. "Let me help you with that." Elaine stepped back quietly, letting the nurse handle it. She didn't say a word. Once the woman was seated, Elaine turned and started walking toward the elevators at the far end of the lobby. The glass walls reflected the morning light, and the sound of beeping machines echoed softly from nearby rooms. She pressed the elevator button and waited. Behind her, she could still hear Karen talking loudly, laughing with another staff member. Elaine's chest ached a little, not from anger but from disappointment. She had always believed that the way someone treated strangers said everything about their character and about the organization they represented. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside. A young intern rushed in at the last moment, panting. "Oh, thank you for holding the door," he said. Elaine smiled kindly. "Of course." As the elevator began to rise, he glanced at her briefly. "Are you visiting someone here?" he asked politely. "You could say that," she replied with a gentle smile. "It's my first day." "Oh, welcome. What department?" he asked. "I'll be working with administration," she said simply. He nodded. "That's great. They say we're getting a new director soon. I hope she's nice. This place really needs some change." Elaine smiled again, her eyes thoughtful. "I hope so too." When the doors opened on the 4th floor, she stepped out and walked down the hallway. The environment here was completely different. Quieter, cleaner, lined with polished floors and framed photos of the hospital's history. Staff members in suits passed by, greeting her with respectful smiles. Dr. Patel was waiting near the conference room, checking his watch. When he saw her, his expression turned to relief. "Dr. Morris, there you are. We were just wondering if you got lost." Elaine laughed softly. "Not lost. Just taking a look around." As they walked inside, a group of department heads stood to greet her. "Good morning, Director Morris," one of them said warmly. Downstairs, life in the lobby went on as usual. Karen had no idea that the woman she had turned away just minutes earlier was now sitting at the head of the executive table, preparing to lead the hospital into a new chapter. While the others discussed schedules, policies, and staffing issues, Elaine's thoughts briefly drifted back to the lobby. She could still hear Karen's voice, firm, dismissive, uninterested. She wondered how many patients or visitors had faced that same treatment before. She wasn't angry, not really. She was sad, because she knew that hospitals were supposed to be places of healing, not judgment. And yet even here bias found its way in, quietly shaping how people were treated. The meeting continued for over an hour, filled with charts, reports, and introductions. But by the end of it, Elaine had made up her mind. The first change she would make wasn't about finances, technology, or policies. It would be about people, about respect, compassion, and the way everyone, from patients to staff, deserved to be treated. When the meeting ended, she stood by the window for a moment, looking out over the city. The sunlight had fully risen now, touching every rooftop, every street, every parked car below. She smiled faintly, thinking about how small actions could ripple through a whole system. One nurse, one choice, one moment of kindness and or lack of it could change everything. And somewhere deep down, she knew that the lesson waiting to unfold that day wouldn't just change one nurse's perspective, it would change the entire hospital's heart. Elaine walked out of the conference room feeling both proud and thoughtful. The meeting had gone well. Everyone had welcomed her warmly, and plans for the next few weeks were already in motion. But her mind kept returning to that small scene in the lobby. The way Nurse Karen had dismissed her so quickly, the way she'd spoken without even listening. It wasn't just about the rudeness. It was about what it represented. If that happened to her, someone who actually ran the hospital, what might be happening every day to the patients who came through those same doors? As she walked down the corridor, she noticed the sunlight streaming through the glass panels. It was beautiful, but it couldn't shake off the heaviness in her chest. She'd always believed that true leadership started with understanding, not just numbers or reports, but people. Later that morning, she decided to go back downstairs, not as the director, but as herself, the woman Karen had mistaken for a lost visitor. She wanted to see how people were being treated without her title in the way. When the elevator doors opened to the main lobby, the scene was just as busy as before. People waiting in line, a baby crying softly somewhere, a volunteer pushing a wheelchair, the sounds of a hospital, life happening moment by moment. Elaine stood quietly for a moment, observing. Karen was still at the front desk, talking to another nurse and laughing about something. Her tone was casual now, light and relaxed. But as soon as a patient walked up, a man in an old jacket holding a file, her expression changed instantly. She looked irritated again. "Yes?" she said, not looking at him. "Do you have an appointment?" The man stammered something about trying to get test results. She sighed loudly, took the paper and said in a tone that everyone nearby could hear, "You were supposed to call first. You can't just walk in and expect me to drop everything." The man apologized softly and stepped aside, clutching his file. Elaine watched this unfold, her heart tightening. She didn't like to judge people too quickly. She knew working in hospitals could be stressful, and some days could wear anyone down. But there was something about the way Karen spoke. Not just tiredness, but a lack of care. A kind of quiet cruelty that came from habit. A young receptionist at the side desk, seeing Elaine standing nearby, smiled politely. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I help you?" Elaine returned the smile. "Oh, I'm just waiting, thank you." The receptionist nodded and went back to her work. A few minutes later, Karen noticed Elaine again. She frowned slightly, then called out across the counter. "Ma'am, didn't I tell you earlier where to go? The clinic is that way." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried enough to make heads turn. People in line glanced at Elaine, some with curiosity, others with mild sympathy. Elaine felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She wasn't angry, just deeply aware of how humiliating moments like this could feel. If she felt this way, how might someone older, sicker, or less confident feel being spoken to like that? She took a calm breath and said, "I'm just waiting for someone." Karen rolled her eyes slightly, then muttered, "All right, but please don't stand in the way. We're very busy this morning." Elaine stepped aside again, her expression unreadable. Nearby, a mother with a small boy in a wheelchair was trying to juggle a clipboard and a bag of medication. The boy looked weak, his head leaning against the chair's cushion. No one seemed to notice them struggling. Without a second thought, Elaine went over and said softly, "Here, let me help you with that." The woman looked up, tired and grateful. "Oh, thank you. I'm just trying to get him checked in." Elaine smiled warmly. "You're doing great. Don't worry, I'll help you." She pushed the wheelchair gently toward the line. Karen, seeing her approach again, frowned. "Ma'am, what are you doing? You can't just—" Before she could finish, the little boy coughed weakly and Karen hesitated. Elaine handed the clipboard back to the mother. "Here you go," she said gently. "Thank you," the woman whispered. Karen didn't say another word. She turned away quickly, pretending to look at her computer screen again. After a few minutes, the mother and boy were taken to a nurse inside, and Elaine went back to the bench where she had sat earlier. The janitor, Mr. Lewis, was mopping nearby again. He gave her a knowing look but said nothing. He just nodded once as if to say, "I see what you're seeing too." Elaine nodded back. A few minutes later, a loud voice came from the hallway. Director Morris. There you are. It was Dr. Patel again, walking briskly toward her. Karen froze at the sound of the name. Dr. Patel smiled broadly. I didn't mean to disturb you, but the board wants to confirm our afternoon meeting. Oh, I see you've met Nurse Willis. He gestured toward Karen, who stood speechless behind the counter. Her face drained of color. For a brief moment, no one moved. The people in the lobby turned to look. The same woman who had been dismissed just minutes earlier was now being addressed with full respect by a senior physician. Elaine gave a small, polite smile. Yes, we've met, Karen stammered. Director Morris? Her voice cracked. I didn't realize. Dr. Patel looked surprised. Oh, she didn't tell you? Elaine's smile didn't waver. No, she didn't have the chance. The silence in the lobby was thick. Even the receptionist stopped typing. The janitor had quietly stepped back, pretending to mop but clearly watching everything. Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Elaine didn't say anything right away. She looked around the lobby, her gaze gentle but full of quiet authority. The people who had been watching now avoided her eyes. Finally, she said calmly, It's all right, Dr. Patel, we all make assumptions sometimes. Karen whispered, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Elaine nodded once. I understand. Then she looked at her, really looked at her. Not with anger, but with a kind of sadness that made Karen shift uncomfortably. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. Shall we go to your office, Director? Yes, Elaine said softly, then turned to Karen one last time. We'll talk later. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it carried weight. As Elaine walked toward the elevator with Dr. Patel, the lobby slowly returned to motion. People began whispering. Karen stood frozen behind her desk, replaying the last hour in her mind. The way she had spoken, the look she'd given, the tone she'd used, all of it now felt heavy, wrong, embarrassing. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she typed on the keyboard. But her mind wasn't on the screen anymore. Upstairs, Elaine entered her new office, a wide room with large windows overlooking the city. But she didn't feel triumphant. Instead, she felt reflective. She sat at her desk, folded her hands, and stared out at the skyline. She thought of Karen, and the countless people like her, people who had built habits over time, treating others differently without even realizing it, sometimes out of tiredness, sometimes out of pride, and sometimes out of something deeper they didn't want to admit. Elaine didn't believe in shaming people publicly. That never changed hearts. What she believed in was truth. Quiet, steady truth that made people stop and think. After a few minutes, there was a knock on her door. Come in, she said. It was Karen. Her face was pale, and she looked smaller somehow, not physically but in presence. She stepped inside nervously, holding her hands together. Director Morris, I just wanted to say how sorry I am. I truly didn't know. I thought. Elaine raised a hand gently. Please sit. Karen sat down on the edge of the chair, eyes downcast. Elaine leaned forward slightly, her tone kind but direct. Karen, I don't need you to apologize for not knowing who I am. That part doesn't matter. What matters is how you spoke, not just to me, but to others. Karen swallowed hard. I didn't mean to be rude. It's just, it gets so busy down there. People come in without appointments and we get told to keep things moving. I guess I just react sometimes without thinking. I understand, Elaine said softly. Hospitals can be stressful. You deal with a lot every day, but we can never let stress replace kindness. The moment we forget compassion, we forget why we're here. Karen nodded quickly. Her eyes filling with tears, she tried to blink away. You're right. I've been working here for years and I used to care so much, but lately I just feel tired. I don't even notice when I sound harsh anymore. Elaine listened quietly. You know, when I first started in healthcare, I was a nurse too, she said. I worked long nights, skipped meals, and sometimes felt invisible. I know how heavy this job can be, but every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with respect, no matter what they look like, what they wear, or how they speak. Karen nodded again, a tear slipping down her cheek. You're right, she whispered. I'm really sorry. Elaine gave a small smile. I believe you are, and that's a start. She paused, then added gently, but we're going to do more than just say sorry. We're going to change how things work around here, starting with training, not to punish but to teach, to help everyone remember why they chose this profession. Karen looked up, surprised. You'd let me stay? Elaine's eyes softened. I don't believe in firing people for their mistakes. I believe in helping them learn from them. Karen's shoulders shook as she exhaled shakily. Thank you, she whispered. Elaine stood and offered her hand. Karen hesitated, then took it. Let's make this hospital a place people feel safe in, Elaine said. That's how we truly heal. Karen nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Director. As she left the office, Elaine sat back and took a deep breath. The morning had been unexpected, uncomfortable, and revealing. But maybe that was exactly what was needed. Because change didn't start with policies. It started with people. One person realizing something they hadn't before. One moment of humility, one decision to do better, and somewhere downstairs, Karen wiped her tears, straightened her uniform, and went back to the front desk, determined to start over. The next few days at Westbridge General Hospital passed quickly, but for Nurse Karen Willis every hour felt heavier than the last. Since that morning with Director Morris, she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head, her tone, her words, the coldness in her voice. Every time she saw the director walking through the halls, her stomach twisted in guilt. Elaine, on the other hand, had returned to her calm and steady rhythm. She attended meetings, spoke with doctors, reviewed patient reports, and quietly observed everything happening around her. But she hadn't forgotten either. She didn't need to call attention to what had happened. She knew life itself would make the lesson stronger if handled the right way. That week, Elaine had been planning her first full staff review. It wasn't going to be just another meeting full of numbers and policies. She wanted it to be something real, something that would touch people's hearts. The hospital had good people, but the spark of empathy had faded under the weight of long hours and routine. She wanted to bring that spark back. By Friday morning, the hospital's main conference room was filled. Nurses, doctors, and support staff gathered in neat rows. The mood was mixed, some curious, some nervous, others just hoping it would end quickly so they could go back to their rounds. Elaine stood near the front window, looking out for a moment before turning to face everyone. She wasn't holding any papers or slides, just her presence, calm, warm, and quietly powerful. Good morning, everyone, she began with a smile. I know you're all busy, so I appreciate you taking time to be here. A few heads nodded. Some people sipped their coffee, others waited politely. I've spent the last few days walking through this hospital, she continued. I've seen how hard you work, how tired some of you are, and how much you care. But I've also seen things that remind me why we sometimes lose our way. Her tone wasn't harsh. It was gentle, but her words carried weight. There's something I've learned in my years in medicine. People don't always remember the treatments we give them, but they never forget how we make them feel. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Elaine paused, letting her words sink in. Then she continued. This hospital is a place of healing. But healing starts long before a doctor writes a prescription or a nurse changes a bandage. It starts with kindness, with the way we look at someone who's scared or confused or hurting. At the back of the room, Karen sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't need Elaine to say her name. She already knew the message was for her and for many others too. Elaine looked around the room again. A few days ago, she said softly, I walked into this hospital like any other visitor. I didn't come through the staff entrance. I wanted to see what our patients see, how they're treated when they first arrive. The room fell silent. Every nurse and doctor turned their eyes toward her. What I found, she said, her tone calm but steady, was that sometimes we judge people before we even speak to them. We make assumptions, based on how they look, how they dress, or how they sound. We forget that every person who walks through those doors has a story. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I was mistaken for someone who didn't belong here, she said, her voice even. I was told to leave. I was told to go to the public clinic. A collective gasp moved through the room. Some people exchanged glances. Karen's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Elaine didn't look at her directly, but Karen felt her words like a mirror reflecting everything she'd done wrong. I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone, Elaine continued. I'm telling you this because it could have been anyone. It could have been a patient in need. It could have been someone's grandmother, or a man in pain who didn't have the right words to explain himself. Every day people walk through our doors scared, tired, and hoping we'll treat them with care, not suspicion. She paused, her gaze moving across the room. And if we fail at that, then no matter how skilled we are, we've forgotten the heart of this profession. The silence that followed was deep, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. Then she smiled faintly. But the good news, she said, is that we can always choose to do better. That's why we're here. That's why we wear these uniforms. Not to look powerful, but to serve. Her eyes softened. Starting next week, we'll begin a new training program focused on empathy and communication. It's not punishment, it's growth. Every person here from top to bottom will take part, including myself. Because kindness isn't a skill we learn once. It's something we have to practice every single day. The crowd slowly began to nod, some even smiling a little. A few people clapped quietly, the sound hesitant at first, then growing stronger. When the meeting ended, people left quietly, speaking in low voices. Many of them looked reflective, as if they'd just seen their work in a new light. Karen remained seated long after everyone else had left. She stared at her hands, the weight of embarrassment still heavy on her chest. But there was something else too. Gratitude. Because even though she'd been wrong, Elaine hadn't humiliated her. She'd used that painful moment to teach everyone a lesson without turning it into anger. She rose slowly and walked out of the conference room. The halls felt quieter than usual. When she reached the lobby, she looked at the same spot where she had stood that morning, behind the front desk, her computer blinking. She could almost see her old self there, impatient, dismissive, unaware. Mr. Lewis, the janitor, passed by with his mop and smiled kindly. "Tough meeting?" he asked lightly. Karen smiled weakly. "Eye-opening," she said. "Really eye-opening." He nodded. "The director's a good one. She's got heart." "Yes," Karen said softly. "She really does." That afternoon, Elaine made her rounds through the hospital. She visited different departments, greeting people by name, listening to their concerns. Wherever she went, people seemed a little more alert, a little more careful with their words. She stopped by the pediatric ward and spoke to a young nurse who was comforting a crying child. The nurse looked up, surprised to see the director standing there, but Elaine only smiled. "You're doing wonderful work," she said. "Sometimes the softest words do more healing than the strongest medicine." The nurse blushed and nodded. Elaine moved on, speaking to doctors, cleaners, volunteers. She treated everyone the same, but with quiet respect. That's what people began to notice most about her. She didn't demand authority. She earned it. A few hours later, she returned to her office. On her desk was a small envelope. There was no name written on it, just a note that said, "Thank you." Inside was a simple piece of paper, handwritten. The words were shaky but honest. "Director Morris, I can't undo how I acted that morning, but I promise I will never forget it. You taught me something without shouting, and I'll spend every day proving I've learned. Thank you for your patience." Karen Elaine smiled as she read it. She folded the note carefully and placed it inside her desk drawer. She didn't need public apologies. This was enough. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere at Westbridge slowly began to shift. The front desk, once a place of tension and impatience, became warmer. Karen started greeting people with genuine smiles. She listened more, spoke gently, and even helped train new staff with a focus on kindness. She made sure every patient who approached the counter was treated with dignity, whether they were wearing a suit or old clothes, whether they spoke clearly or stumbled over their words. One morning, a young man came rushing in, worried about his mother who had collapsed at home. His voice trembled and his hands shook as he explained what happened. Karen immediately stood, walked around the counter, and guided him toward the emergency wing herself. "It's okay," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll take care of her." Elaine happened to walk by just then. She watched quietly from a distance, her heart lifting as she saw the scene. There it was, the change she'd hoped for unfolding naturally, beautifully. Later, Karen noticed her standing there. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment words weren't needed. The look said everything. Gratitude, respect, understanding. That afternoon, the hospital staff gathered for a brief meeting to review progress in different departments. When it was time to discuss patient feedback, the results were clear. More positive comments, fewer complaints about communication or coldness. Patients were noticing the difference. One of the nurses said, "It feels lighter around here lately. People are smiling more." Elaine nodded with a smile. "That's what healing looks like," she said. As the meeting ended, she stayed behind for a while, looking around the now empty room. Change, she realized, didn't come from big speeches or dramatic gestures. It came from the quiet decision to be better today than you were yesterday. Downstairs, Karen was helping an elderly man fill out a form. Her tone was gentle, her patience endless. When the man thanked her, she smiled and said, "You're welcome. Take your time. We're here to help." The man nodded gratefully. "You have a kind heart, young lady. Not many do these days." Karen felt her eyes sting a little, but she smiled through it. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." Elaine walked past just then carrying a file. She heard the exchange and smiled to herself. She didn't stop or say anything. She didn't need to. The hospital hummed with quiet energy, people moving with purpose, voices softer, faces kinder. It wasn't perfect, but it was different, alive in a new way. And for the first time in a long while, Elaine felt a deep peace in her heart. Because she knew now that true leadership wasn't about control or command. It was about planting seeds of change and trusting that they would grow. She looked out through the glass doors of the lobby where the sunlight streamed in, washing everything in gold. The same doors where she'd once been turned away now stood open, a symbol of how far they'd come. And somewhere deep inside, she whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." The following month brought a sense of calm and renewal across Westbridge General Hospital. The walls, once echoing with rushed footsteps and impatient voices, now carried softer sounds, laughter from the nurses' station, calm conversations at the reception, the hum of teamwork. It wasn't magic. It was effort, small acts of kindness multiplied over time. And though most people didn't notice it happening day by day, Elaine did. She saw it in the way staff spoke to patients, in how they treated one another, and in the way the entire place started to feel more like a family than a workplace. Still, she knew that change, no matter how positive, always came with challenges. There were still people struggling to adjust, habits that ran deep, pride that took time to soften. One of those people was Karen. Karen had improved in many ways. Her tone was gentler now, her patience stronger, but inside she still carried a shadow of guilt and fear. She respected Elaine deeply, but she also felt nervous whenever the director came near. She wanted to make things right, not just in action, but in heart. One afternoon, Elaine was walking through the lobby when she noticed Karen helping a young man who looked distraught. His sister had just been admitted after a car accident, and he could barely speak through his panic. Karen guided him through the paperwork, spoke softly, and then personally walked him to the waiting area. Elaine watched quietly from a distance. When the young man sat down, Karen gave him a comforting pat on the shoulder before returning to the desk. That small moment stayed with Elaine. She decided it was time to have a real conversation with Karen, not as a superior to an employee, but as one person to another. Later that day, she sent a message to Karen asking her to stop by her office after her shift. When Karen saw the message, her stomach dropped a little. The last time she'd been called there, it had been about her behavior that morning she'd rather forget. As the day went on, she tried to keep herself calm, convincing herself it was probably just a check-in or routine discussion. Still, as the clock neared 5, her hands began to tremble slightly. She fixed her uniform, took a deep breath, and made her way upstairs. Elaine's office was quiet, filled with soft afternoon light. A pot of tea sat on the table beside 2 cups. Elaine looked up as Karen entered and smiled. "Come in, Karen, please sit." Karen sat carefully, hands clasped in her lap. "You wanted to see me, Director?" "Yes," Elaine said gently. "Would you like some tea?" Karen hesitated. "Oh, I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," Elaine said, pouring a cup for both of them. "You've had a long day." They sat for a moment in silence, the kind of silence that feels full rather than awkward. Finally, Elaine spoke. "I watched you this morning helping that young man." "You handled it beautifully." Karen blinked, surprised. "Oh, thank you. I just wanted to make sure he didn't feel lost." Elaine nodded. "And that's exactly what makes a difference. Moments like that. People may not remember every name or face, but they remember how we made them feel safe. Karen smiled faintly. I've been trying, Director. I really have. I know you have, Elaine said warmly, and I can see the change. But tell me, how have you been feeling through all of this? Honestly, Karen hesitated, not sure how to answer. I guess I'm doing better, but sometimes I still feel ashamed of that first day. Every time I see you, I remember how I spoke to you. It's hard to let it go. Elaine leaned back in her chair. You know, Karen, shame can be a teacher if we let it be. It's only dangerous when we live inside it for too long. You've already learned what you needed to. Now it's about growth. Karen looked down, her eyes misty. You've been very kind to me. Most people in your position would have written me up or worse. But instead, you've helped me see things I didn't even realize about myself. Elaine smiled softly. That's because I believe everyone deserves a second chance. I've had to learn my own lessons too, more than once. The important thing is what we do next. Karen nodded, her voice quiet. I think I used to see this job like a routine. Forms, check-ins, schedules. I forgot that every person who stands in front of me is scared of something. Now I try to see that first. Elaine's eyes softened. That's what makes you a better nurse now. Not perfection, awareness. They sat for another moment, sipping tea. Then Elaine said, Karen, there's something else I wanted to discuss. We're planning a new community outreach program. Free health checkups and workshops for underserved neighborhoods. I want you to help lead the front desk team for it. Karen's eyes widened. Me? You want me to lead it? Yes, Elaine said simply. You've grown a lot, and I think you're the right person to represent the spirit we're trying to build. Compassion first. Karen was silent, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Elaine said with a gentle smile. Karen laughed softly, wiping her eyes. Then yes. Absolutely yes, Elaine nodded, pleased. Good, it'll be a challenge, but I believe in you. For a moment, the two women sat there, not as boss and employee, but as equals. Two people who had met through misunderstanding and ended up changing each other in quiet but powerful ways. When Karen left the office, she felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time, she wasn't just trying to make up for a mistake. She was building something new. The following week, the outreach event began. It was held in the hospital courtyard, filled with tents, tables, and smiling volunteers. There were doctors giving free checkups, nurses teaching families about nutrition, and kids laughing as they got little stickers that said, healthy and strong. Karen stood at the main registration booth, greeting everyone who came through. Her energy was bright and welcoming, her smile genuine. She no longer looked like the woman who once hid behind a computer screen. Elaine moved through the crowd, shaking hands, answering questions, and chatting with community members. She stopped by Karen's table at one point, watching as she gently guided an elderly woman through the sign-up sheet. You've done a wonderful job organizing this, Elaine said, once there was a pause. Karen looked up and smiled. Thank you. Honestly, I was nervous, but everyone's been amazing. The staff's really come together. That's the power of purpose, Elaine said. When people feel connected to something bigger than themselves, everything changes. The day went on, and as the sun began to set, the courtyard glowed with a golden light. Volunteers packed up supplies while families waved goodbye, promising to come back for follow-ups. When the last tent came down, Karen stood for a moment, taking in the sight. She felt proud, not just of the event, but of herself. A few months ago, she had been a different person, cold, tired, and impatient. Now she felt alive again, connected to why she had chosen this profession in the first place. Elaine walked up beside her. You did well today, she said. Karen smiled. We all did. Yes, Elaine said softly. But you led with heart. That's something special. They both looked at the courtyard, now empty except for a few chairs and a stray balloon caught in a bush. The air smelled of coffee and faint laughter. Director, Karen said quietly, can I ask you something? Of course. That morning, when I spoke to you the way I did, why didn't you tell me right away who you were? You could have stopped me in a second. Elaine smiled, her gaze far away. Because sometimes people need to face their reflection before they can see clearly. If I had told you then, you would have felt embarrassed, but maybe not changed. But when truth reveals itself naturally, it leaves a mark that lasts. Karen nodded slowly. It did leave a mark, a deep one. Elaine looked at her kindly. Then I'm glad, because that means the lesson was real. They stood there in silence for a while, the evening breeze moving gently through the trees. The hospital lights flickered on behind them, glowing softly against the darkening sky. "I want to thank you," Karen said quietly, "for seeing more in me than I saw in myself." Elaine turned to her. "You don't need to thank me. You did the hard part, you changed." Karen smiled. "Maybe, but you gave me the reason to." Elaine's expression softened. "Sometimes that's all people need. A reason." As the last bit of sunlight disappeared, they began walking back toward the entrance. The glass doors opened automatically, and the familiar hum of the hospital filled the air again, steady, comforting, alive. Inside, a few nurses waved goodnight. A cleaner was polishing the floors. Somewhere down the hall, a patient laughed at something their visitor said. It was an ordinary evening, but for Elaine it felt extraordinary, because every smile, every act of patience, every gentle tone, they were all part of something bigger now. A culture of kindness had taken root. And it had all started with one simple moment in a busy lobby. One wrong assumption turned into a story of growth. As they reached the front desk, Karen paused, looking at the spot where it had all begun. She smiled. "You know, every time I stand here now, I remember that morning. And instead of feeling ashamed, I feel grateful, because it taught me who I want to be." Elaine nodded slowly. "That's how transformation feels. Quiet but powerful." Karen looked around the lobby, watching patients being greeted warmly, volunteers offering directions, and doctors smiling as they passed by. "It's amazing," she said softly, "how different this place feels now." Elaine's eyes glowed with pride. "Yes, because we changed how we see people. That changes everything." They stood together for a moment longer before Elaine said, "Go home and rest, Karen. You've done more than enough for one day." Karen smiled. "Thank you, Director, for everything." Elaine watched her leave, her steps confident and light. Then she turned toward the window, gazing out at the night. The reflection of the hospital lights shimmered on the glass, and she could see her own faint smile there, one of quiet fulfillment. Because she knew this was what true leadership looked like. Not about titles or authority, but about hearts changed one at a time. The months after the community program were some of the most fulfilling ones the hospital had ever seen. Things were running smoother, and not because of new policies or stricter rules, but because people were beginning to truly understand one another. The hospital wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was becoming a place of trust, between staff, between patients, and even between strangers who had once passed each other in silence. Every morning, Elaine made her usual rounds. She liked walking through the hospital before the day got too busy, greeting the early shift nurses, stopping by the cafeteria for a cup of tea, and saying hello to anyone who crossed her path. She believed in being visible, not just as a leader, but as a fellow human being who cared about the same things as everyone else. The atmosphere had changed in small, beautiful ways. You could see it in the smiles, in how staff helped one another without being asked, in how the front desk now felt like a place of welcome rather than a wall. Karen had grown into one of the most trusted nurses at the hospital. She was patient, kind, and respected by her coworkers. People often came to her for advice, not just about work, but about life. She had gone from being someone who spoke without thinking to someone who listened deeply before she spoke. One quiet afternoon, Elaine sat in her office reviewing some reports when there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she said. The door opened and Karen stepped inside holding a small envelope. "Director," she said with a shy smile, "I just wanted to drop this off." "Something small." Elaine set her papers aside. "What is it?" Karen handed her the envelope. "It's an invitation. My daughter is graduating from nursing school next week. I'd be honored if you came." Elaine looked up, genuinely touched. "That's wonderful news, Karen. Of course I'll be there." Karen smiled warmly. "She's the reason I became a nurse. She used to tell me, 'Mom, you're so good with people, you should work in a hospital.' I guess she was right." Elaine laughed softly. "Seems she has your spirit." Karen nodded, then hesitated. "You know, when she was younger, I always told her to treat everyone with respect, no matter what. And then, I forgot to follow my own advice for a while. I think about that day a lot, but not with regret anymore. I think of it as the moment that woke me up." Elaine listened quietly, smiling. Sometimes life gives us lessons in the most unexpected ways. But what matters is that you learned and you grew. Karen nodded slowly. Thank you, Director, for giving me the chance to become better. Elaine smiled. You gave that chance to yourself, Karen. I just held up the mirror. They shared a quiet laugh, and for a moment the office felt like a warm refuge from the busy world outside. When Karen left, Elaine sat for a while, thinking about how much could change when kindness met humility. The day of the graduation came, and Elaine kept her promise. She arrived at the community hall where the ceremony was held, sitting near the back. She didn't want attention, she just wanted to be there. She watched as Karen's daughter walked across the stage, beaming with pride, her cap slightly crooked, her eyes shining as she looked out at her mother. Karen stood in the audience, clapping with tears in her eyes. When the ceremony ended, she spotted Elaine and ran over, almost speechless. You came, she said softly. I told you I would, Elaine replied, smiling. You must be so proud. I am, Karen said, her voice trembling slightly. She's everything I hoped she'd be. Elaine placed a hand on her shoulder. And she'll be even better because of the example you've become. Karen blinked back tears. You really mean that? I do, Elaine said. You've taught this hospital what compassion looks like in action. The two women stood there for a moment, surrounded by families taking pictures, laughing and celebrating. It was a simple moment, but it carried so much meaning. The past, and with all its mistakes and lessons, had transformed into something beautiful. In the following weeks, life at the hospital continued to move forward. New interns joined, new patients came and went, and every day brought new challenges. But the culture that had been built remained strong. Elaine had introduced monthly reflection sessions, not meetings, but open conversations where staff could share experiences, frustrations, or simple stories from their day. At first, people were shy, unsure what to say, but over time it became one of the most cherished traditions. Karen often spoke during those sessions. She never brought up the original incident directly, but everyone knew what had happened. She would talk about empathy, about how every person walking through the doors might be carrying something invisible. Her words carried weight because they came from a place of truth. One day, a young nurse stood up during a session and said, Karen, you inspire me. Sometimes I catch myself judging people too quickly. And then I remember how you always say, see the person, not the problem. It helps me slow down. Karen smiled, a little embarrassed but deeply touched. Thank you, she said. We all need reminders. Even me. Elaine watched from her seat, feeling proud. The woman who once raised her voice in frustration was now the one teaching others to listen. That kind of change couldn't be written into a policy or taught in a manual. It came from experience, from heart. Outside of the hospital, word had begun to spread about Westbridge's new programs and approach. Other healthcare facilities reached out, wanting to learn from what they had done. Elaine was invited to speak at conferences, to share how empathy had transformed not just morale, but performance. But she always gave credit where it was due. This change started with one encounter, she'd say in her speeches. One moment of misunderstanding that turned into an opportunity to see what we could be, together. She never mentioned names, never told the story for attention. She spoke about the lesson, that respect and compassion are not luxuries, they're necessities. And that true leadership begins when we start treating every person, no matter their role, with dignity. Back at the hospital, Karen continued to grow. She eventually became a mentor for new staff, guiding them through their first months, teaching them not just how to do their job, but how to feel it. She would remind them gently, everyone has a story. You might not know it, but it's there. So be kind first. Always be kind first. Years passed. Some faces changed, some stayed the same. The hospital grew, expanded its wings, added new departments, and welcomed more patients than ever before. Yet even with all the change, the spirit Elaine had worked so hard to nurture remained. One day, as she prepared to retire, Elaine walked through the hospital one last time. The halls were bright and busy, filled with laughter and chatter. She saw Karen at the reception desk, now with streaks of silver in her hair, still wearing that same warm smile. Elaine approached quietly, and Karen looked up. Director, she said with a grin, though her eyes were misty. So it's really your last day? Elaine nodded. It is. It's time to let others lead now. Karen stood, her voice soft. You've changed this place forever. None of us will forget what you've done. Elaine smiled. All I did was remind everyone what they were capable of. You all did the rest. Karen stepped around the desk and hugged her, something that would have felt impossible years ago. Thank you, she whispered, for believing in me. Elaine held her tightly. You earned that belief. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the sounds of ringing phones, footsteps, and distant laughter, the living heartbeat of the hospital. As Elaine left the building for the last time, she turned back once just to look at the lobby, the place where everything had started, the place where one act of impatience had led to a lifetime of growth. She smiled to herself and whispered, worth every moment. Karen watched from inside as the doors closed behind her. She stood quietly, her mind filled with memories. Then she turned to a new nurse standing nearby who looked a little overwhelmed.